This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to showcase an Oathbreaker deck tech with Nicol Bolas God-Pharaoh as the Oathbreaker and Deliver Unto Evil as the signature spell. Thank you for joining us for this Oathbreaker deck tech. We're going to begin with Nicol Bolas God-Pharaoh. Here we have a Bolas Planeswalker that comes into play with 7 loyalty counters for 4 generic mana and Grixis colors. That's 1 blue, 1 black, and 1 red mana. For 2 loyalty counters, that's a +2. Target opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card, and until end of turn, we may cast that card without paying its mana cost. For +1 loyalty, each opponent exiles 2 cards from their hand. For -4, Nicol Bolas God-Pharaoh deals 7 damage to target opponent or creature an opponent controls. And his ultimate Big Bang ability, taking off 12 loyalty counters, exile each non-land permanent your opponents control. So what we have here is an ultimate resource depleting Planeswalker, and the build, the 58 to follow, is going to help to heighten and enhance what Nicol Bolas God-Pharaoh wants to do. That is, disrupt our opponents, remove their permanents, and do everything we can to make sure that the balance of resources tilts greatly in our favor. The signature spell in this Oathbreaker deck is Deliver Unto Evil. It's a sorcery for 2 and 1 black mana. We choose up to 4 target cards in our graveyard. If we control a Bolas Planeswalker, we return each of those cards to our hand. Otherwise, an opponent chooses 2 of them, we leave the chosen cards in our graveyard and then put the rest into our hand. Since we can only cast our signature spell with our Oathbreaker on our side of the battlefield, we are always going to be able to put 4 cards from our graveyard right back into our hand. And even though this spell says to exile it upon its revolution, since this is the signature spell in an Oathbreaker deck, it will just be exiled to its accompanying command zone. What this spell allows us to do is to bring more and more of those resource depleting and control spells from our graveyard back to our hand so that we can continue to manage the battlefield and win the long game. Alright, so that is our Oathbreaker, and that is our signature spell. Now it is time to unveil the 58 of this deck, and we're going to begin with the land base. We're playing 3 colors here, so it's going to be a bit of a challenge in a 58-card library to find ways in which to balance these colors accordingly so that we can cast the spells as we need to. So with that in mind, we're going to start off with just 9 basic lands, 3 of each color. We have 3 islands, we have 3 swamps, and 3 mountains, a total of 9 basic lands to kick off this deck tech. The following lands are all non-basic lands that are in this build as a way in which to help fix the 3 color mana necessary to make the deck work. We begin with a Grixis Panorama, taps for a colorless, but more importantly, we can pay 1 mana, tap this, and sacrifice it to search our library for a basic island, swamp, or mountain card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Next, we have the best land in the format, that is going to be Command Tower. This is going to tap for any one of the colors we need that are in our commander's color identity. After that, we have our first pathway of this deck tech. It is River Glide Pathway. On the back side of this is going to be the red side of this pathway, which is going to be a Lava Glide Pathway. Now, this does not fix our mana for the entirety of the game. This helps us more in the immediacy of the turn that we put it into play, whether we need blue or red at the time of putting that land onto our side of the battlefield. Next up, we're going to play with a couple of different shock lands here in Steam Vents and Blood Crypt. They're going to come into play tapped unless we pay 2 life. They're going to tap for one of 2 different colors of mana. Those 2 lands are going in. Next up, we are going to play with a copy of Tainted Peak. This is going to act as a pseudo-dual land as long as we have a swamp on our side of the battlefield. It taps for a colorless mana or it taps for a black or red mana, but that last ability we can only activate as long as we control a swamp. Staying in tune with our Rakdos colored lands, we're going to play with a copy of Dragonskull Summit. Comes into play tapped unless we control a mountain or a swamp. After that, we have our Rakdos Filterland and Graven Cairns is going to tap for 1 colorless mana, or we can pay a black or a red into this and tap it to produce 2 black, 2 red, or 1 of each. Next up, going with Tainted Peak, we have Tainted Isle. This is going to tap for a colorless mana, but it'll also tap for a blue or a black as long as we control a swamp. Next up, as you're seeing a trend following here, now we have a Drowned Catacombs. This is our Dimir checkland. It comes into play tapped unless we control an island or a swamp, and it taps for either a blue or a black mana. Second last land in this deck, we have a Sunken Hollow. It is an island swamp. It's going to come into play tapped unless we control 2 or more basic lands. And the last land in this build is Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. As you'll see, that black kind of slants more favorably for the spells in this deck. We want to make sure that we have enough black mana in order to cast all of those spells. Additionally, by including cards like Tainted Peak and Tainted Isle, and Drowned Catacomb and Dragon Skull Summit, we'll always have a swamp on our side of the battlefield in order to have those lands tap for the colored mana we want and to come into the battlefield untapped. So there you have it. That is the land base of this Oathbreaker deck. So with the land base out of the way, we're not done with our mana yet. Next up, we're going to have some mana rocks going into this Grixis build because, let's face it, we're not playing green. Arcane Signet is a must. It's a CMC 2 mana rock that's going to tap for any of the colors in our Oathbreaker's color identity. I think I said that earlier with Command Tower. I should make sure I switch that so I don't get lit up in the comment section below. Command Tower is going to give us 1 mana of any color of our Oathbreaker's color identity. All right, and next is going to be 1 each of the 3 appropriate signets. We've got a Dimir signet, an Izzet signet, and a Rakdos signet. CMC of 2, we pay 1 generic mana into these, tap them to give us 2 mana, 1 of 2 different colors. And the last mana rock in this build is going to be a Chromatic Lantern. With this on our side of the battlefield, we will never have to worry about color fixing for any of our spells. It gives lands we control tap, add 1 mana of any color, and it itself can tap to add 1 mana of any color. Alright, so those are our mana rocks to go alongside with our land base. Now let's get into some removal and disruption because the list is lengthy because this is a true Grixis control deck. Let's begin with making sure that we can take care of our opponent's planeswalkers, i.e. their Oathbreakers, by including 1 copy of Dreadbore, sorcery speed, a black and a red, destroy target creature or planeswalker. Most likely we're going to make sure that we tap the mana needed to get rid of one of our opponent's Oathbreakers. Next, of course, since we're playing black, we have to include a copy of the Elder Spell. 2 black mana, we destroy any number of target planeswalkers, or for this particular format, any number of target Oathbreakers. Then we choose a planeswalker we control, and we put 2 loyalty counters on it for each planeswalker destroyed this way. The quicker we can uptick Nicol Bolas, the quicker we can use its ultimate Big Bang ability to exile all non-land permanents in our opponent's control. Shifting our focus more to battlefield management as it pertains to creatures, 1 copy of Terminate. Black and red at instant speed, we destroy target creature, and it cannot be regenerated. Next up, for another way in which to get rid of a creature or a planeswalker, we have Vraska's Contempt. 2 and 2 black mana at instant speed, we exile target creature or target planeswalker, which of course could be target Oathbreaker. We gain 2 life in the process. Next up, we have another instant. This is Liliana's Triumph. Each opponent sacrifices a creature. If we control a Liliana Planeswalker, which we will not in this deck, then each opponent would also discard a card. For the purposes of this Grixis build, this is all Bolas, so when we cast Liliana's Triumph, each opponent sacrifices a creature. Next, staying with instants, we have Soul Shatter. 2 and a black at instant speed. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the highest converted mana cost among creatures and planeswalkers they control. This is Oathbreaker, so it's very, very likely that we'll be able to get a lot of stuff off of our opponent's sides of the battlefield for just the paltry investment of 2 and 1 black mana, and that again is at instant speed. Again, 2 and a black mana at instant speed, we have Vona's Hunger. This has the Ascend mechanic, which means if we control 10 or more permanents, then we get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. Each opponent sacrifices a creature, and if we have the City's Blessing, instead each opponent sacrifices half the creatures they control, rounded up. A very, very economical and resourceful way to manage our opponent's sides of the battlefield. Even more of a deterrent to make sure that our opponents do not try to attack us is 1 copy of No Mercy. This is an enchantment for 2 and 2 black mana. Whenever a creature successfully deals damage to us, we destroy it. Note that this does not have to be combat damage in order to destroy the creature through No Mercy. All it has to do is deal damage to us, and No Mercy will then say, bye-bye. And next up, we have a sorcery, 3 and 2 red. It is Hour of Devastation. All creatures lose indestructible until end of turn, and Hour of Devastation deals 5 damage to each creature and each non-Bolas Planeswalker. I love the fact that this is a non-Bolas Planeswalker removal spell, because 5 damage spread around the entire battlefield more likely than not should leave our Oathbreaker as the lone as the lone non-Planeswalker, non-creature permanent left on the battlefield. All right, next up, we're going to continue with our battlefield management, but we're shifting away from instant and sorcery spells to some creatures. Of course, since we're playing black, we must include a copy of Vampire Hexmage. 2 black mana for a 2/1 first strike. That's not the best or only reasons why it's in this deck. We can sacrifice Vampire Hexmage to remove all counters from target permanent. In this format, this pretty much means sacrifice Vampire Hexmage and destroy target Oathbreaker. Next after that, we have Plaguecrafter, 2 and a black mana. It's a 3/2 when it comes into play. Each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, and each player who can't discards a card. So for us, of course, we'll most likely just sacrifice the Plaguecrafter to its own ability, and if we catch any of our opponents with their Oathbreakers on their sides of the battlefield, but no other creatures, they're going to be returned to their command zone. And if they don't have any creatures or planeswalkers, then we will deplete their resources even further by making them discard a card. All right, next up we have Massacre Girl, 3 and 2 black, a 4/4 with Menace. When Massacre Girl comes into play, each other creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. And whenever a creature dies this turn, each creature other than Massacre Girl gets -1/-1 until end of turn. It is not difficult for Massacre Girl to come down onto the battlefield and end up being the only creature remaining after her ability triggers. And lastly, for this section of the deck tech, we went from Massacre Girl to Massacre Worm. Here we're going 3 and triple black for a 6/5 worm that when it comes into play, creatures our opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn. Whenever a creature an opponent controls is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, that player loses 2 life. So not only can Massacre Worm remove from the battlefield oodles and noodles of creatures, for each one that goes to the graveyard, it's going to force its controller to lose 2 life. All right, so as you can see, we definitely have a Grixis theme here. We're looking to control, we're looking to deplete resources, we are just looking to completely take over the battlefield. Next up, we're going to continue with our Grixisness with some disruption spells. Here we have Rakdos Charm, one of the best charms in Magic. It's a black and a red at instant speed. We choose one of the following 3 modes. Either we exile all cards from target player's graveyard, just in case there are any Oathbreaker players at our table that are, participating in any graveyard shenanigans. Or we can destroy target artifact, or we can have each creature deal 1 damage to its controller. Since this is a very creature-light build because of the makeup of a true Grixis control shell, casting Rakdos Charm for its 3rd mode should do very little to hurt us because we should not have too many creatures on our side of the battlefield. All right, next up we have Mana Drain, 2 blue, instant speed. We counter target spell, and at the beginning of our next main phase, we add an amount of colorless mana equal to that spell's converted mana cost. An early turn casting of Mana Drain, if done at the right time, could put Nicol Bolas God-Pharaoh from our command zone onto our side of the battlefield several turns ahead of curve. Next up, we have Kolaghan's Command. Another instant. This is 1 in Rakdos colors, and we choose 2 of the following 4 modes. We return target creature card from our graveyard to our hand. Yes, as noted earlier when we were talking about Rakdos Charm, this is a creature-light build, but the creatures that we have in this build pack quite a wallop, and if we need to get one of them from the graveyard back to our hand, selecting this mode from Kolaghan's Command can definitely do that for us. We can also have target player discard a card, we can destroy target artifact, or Kolaghan's Command deals 2 damage to target creature or player. Actually, that might have been eroded to 2 damage to any target. I would check that in the Gatherer. That may be 2 damage to any target, which if it is, then we can also target an opponent's Planeswalker or their Oathbreaker, of course. That might be any target. Next up, and a sneaky good card to include in this deck, particularly because we are usually creature light, is Reigns of Power. Instant speed, 2 and 2 blue mana. We and target opponent each untap and gain control of all creatures the other controls until the end of turn. Those creatures are unaffected by summoning sickness, which means they have haste, and and then at the end of the turn they go back to their controllers. So if we have 1 or no creatures on our side of the battlefield and our opponents have plenty, we can quick cast Reigns of Power, swap out the creatures, and attack that opponent with their own cards. Or, if we're being attacked when we have very little, if any, defenses, then we can borrow one of our other opponent's creatures to block those creatures. Next up, we have a sorcery here. It's 2 in Grixis colors. It's Dark Intimations. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, then discards a card. We may return a creature or planeswalker card from our graveyard to our hand, and then we draw a card. This perfectly highlights exactly what we want this Grixis build to do. We want our opponent's resources to be depleted while we continue to enhance our own. Gradually, the disparity in resources will become such a chasm-like gap that we will just simply assume control of the game and grind our opponents down for the imminent victory. When we cast a Bolas Planeswalker spell, exile Dark Intimation from our graveyard, and that Planeswalker enters the battlefield with an additional loyalty counter on it. That would bring Bolas up from 7 to starting at 8, which may not seem like a big deal, but if we slowly slide this sorcery to the right, if we come in with 8 loyalty counters, it only takes 2 turns at +2 to get Bolas up to 12, so that we can take those loyalty counters off to execute his Big Bang ultimate ability. And next up, of course, we're going to include a copy of Cruel Ultimatum. Here we have 2 blue, 3 black, and 2 red. Target opponent sacrifices a creature, discards 3 cards, then loses 5 life. We return a creature card from our graveyard to our hand, draw 3 cards, and then gain 5 life. No, this doesn't affect every opponent at the Oathbreaker table, but this is definitely a spell we cast as we near the end game. If we're down to 1 opponent and we cast Cruel Ultimatum targeting that opponent, it seems very likely that after the spell resolves, we should be easily able to win the game just because of the swapping of resources that sorcery will lend to us. Alright, so we talked about depleting our opponent's resources. Now let's talk about buffing our own. We're going to include a copy of Jeska's Will. 2 in a red, we choose 1. If we control Nicol Bolas, who is our Oathbreaker, of course, as we cast the spell, we may choose both. Either we add a red mana for each card in target opponent's hand, or we exile the top 3 cards of our library and we may play them this turn. Casting a well-timed Jeska's Will could be the difference between winning the game and making it even more difficult for our opponents to do the same. Either way, we want that card in our hand so that we can cast it and gain the best of both worlds, as long as we've got Nicol Bolas on our side of the battlefield as well. Next, we have Fact or Fiction. 3 in a blue at instant speed. We reveal the top 5 cards of our library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. We put 1 pile into our hand and the other into our graveyard. Because of the way in which we're constructing this deck, there seems to be very little benefits to partaking in any kind of politicking, just because I don't believe any of our opponents will want to do so. So an opponent may make the decision very difficult for us, but still, at a minimum, we're getting more cards in our hand for casting Fact or Fiction. Alright, now we're going to continue with this, and we're going to talk about some more ways in which that we can increase and enhance our own resources. We're going to now shift to a slew of creatures that are going to help us accomplish that. The first is Augur of Bolas. It's a 1/3 for 1 and a blue one. When an ETB, as we look at the top 3 cards of our library, we may reveal an instant or sorcery card from among them and put that card into our hand. We put the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. Next, we have Thief of Sanity, 1 in Dimir colors for a 2/2 flyer. Whenever Thief of Sanity deals combat damage to a player, we look at the top 3 cards of that player's library. We exile one of them face down and then put the rest into their graveyard. For as long as that card remains exiled, we may look at it, we may cast it, and we may spend mana as though we're mana of any color to cast that spell. Here, we're helping ourselves to the top of our opponent's library by making an extension of our hand their cards. And we get to do that when Thief of Sanity hits with its evasive combat. Next up, we have Hull Breacher, 2 and a blue mana for a 3/2 Merfolk Pirate with Flash. And if an opponent would draw a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, instead we create a treasure token. A well-timed Hull Breacher could be absolutely devastating for an opponent and a windfall of riches for us. The same could be said for Opposition Agent. Again, a 2 and a black for a 3/2 with Flash. This human rogue has us control our opponents while they're searching their library. And while an opponent is searching their library, they exile each card they find. We may play those cards for as long as they remain exiled, and once again, we may spend mana as though we're mana of any color to cast them. You could really start to see all the pieces falling into places how we are going to control all of our opponents during this game. Next up, and upticking the overall mana value from 3 to 4, we have Hostage Taker, 2 in Dimir colors for a 2/3 human pirate. When Hostage Taker ETBs, we exile target artifact or creature until this guy leaves the battlefield. Is it the guy? Actually, no. It might be a woman. Okay, so we'll just say when this human pirate enters the battlefield. All right, so we may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled, and we may spend mana as though we're mana of any type to cast that spell. That seems to be a nice little trend that we built in here as a sub-theme, using our own mana as mana of any color to cast our opponent's own cards. Next up, another mana value of 4. Here we have 1 in Grixis colors for Nicol Bolas the Ravager, a 4/4 flying Elder Dragon. When Nicol Bolas the Ravager comes into play, each opponent discards a card. We can pay 4 in Grixis colors, which is exactly the casting cost of our Oathbreaker, to exile Nicol Bolas and then return it to the battlefield, transformed under its owner's control. We can activate this ability only anytime we could cast a sorcery, which is a bit of an onion in the ointment, but as we're playing a grindy mid to long game, it may not be that bad when we find out what we get in return. If we do get the transformation of the Ravager, we get Nicol Bolas the Arisen. Comes into play with another 7 loyalty counters. +2, we draw 2 cards. -3, Nicol Bolas the Arisen deals 10 damage to target creature or planeswalker. -4, we put target creature or planeswalker card from our graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. And then -12, we exile all but the bottom card of target player's library. The big bang here is much more impactful because that opponent will have 1, maybe 2 turns to do anything before they draw a card from an empty library, which means they lose the game. All right, next up, we're going up to 6 CMC with Grixis the Purger, a 6/6 flying dragon. When it deals combat damage to a player, we may pay 2 and a black mana, and if we do, we choose a color, then that player reveals their hand and discards all cards of that color. If we're sitting down at a table with some opponents that are playing mono-color Oathbreaker decks, one swing of Grixis the Purger could be absolutely devastating. And the last creature in this little section before we start to close out this deck tech, of course it had to be Etali Primal Storm. 4 and 2 red mana for a 6/6 Elder Dinosaur. Whenever Etali attacks, note that it's whenever Etali attacks, it does not have to deal combat damage for its effect to trigger. All it has to do is attack. And when it does, we exile the top card of each player's library, and then we may cast any number of non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. Here we don't have to worry about using our mana as mana of any color. We just get to cast the spells for free. All right, we're down to our last 3 cards, and these 3 cards are just going to be some miscellaneous spells that are included as ways in which to enhance and strengthen our Grixis control theme. The first is Dreadhorde Butcher. I almost said Hutcher for some reason. Dreadhorde Butcher is a 2/2 zombie. I'm sorry, a 1/1 zombie. All right, let's try this one again. Dreadhorde Butcher is a 1/1 zombie warrior with haste for Rakdos colors. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player or a planeswalker, we put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. An early turn Dreadhorde Butcher could put so many +1/+1 counters on it that removing it may become a liability for our opponents. Next up, we have Nightscape Familiar. It's a 1/1 zombie for 1 on a black mana. Blue spells and red spells we cast cost 1 generic mana less to cast. And also, this guy could block for days because it has Regenerate. We can pay 1 on a black mana to regenerate Nightscape Familiar. Also note that for Nightscape Familiar, and if it synergizes with blue and red spells, like our Oathbreaker up there, that would be 2 generic mana less to cast, and that would make Nicol Bolas just have a mana cost of 5. And lastly, the card number 58 in this deck tech, it is Spark Double. It's an illusion for 3 and a blue, and we may have it enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature or planeswalker we control, except if it's a creature, it has an additional +1/+1 counter on it. If it's a planeswalker, an additional loyalty counter, and if that permanence is legendary, then Spark Double is not. Imagine having the benefit of 2 Nicol Bolas God-Pharaohs on our side of the battlefield at the same time. That could happen with Spark Double. All right, there you have it, MTGBC. We have completed our Nicol Bolas God-Pharaoh Deliver Unto Evil Oathbreaker deck tech. Let me know your thoughts about this deck in the comments section below, and also note that you can click the link in the description below to see this deck list on tappedout.net. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.